Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories number 48 from mid-September 2025. John Henry Fow, Ducky for the walk, Foghorn for the talk.
That are covered with thorn. Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace?
Welcome to the mid-September 2025 48th episode of Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, an historic and active cemetery in Bala, Pennsylvania. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, amateur historian, volunteer tour guide, volunteer podcaster. I'm recording this on September 11th, 2025. Laurel Hill West opened in 1869 across the river from its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill East in Philadelphia. It's more than twice as big as Laurel Hill East. It has a totally different feel and a strikingly different population. Laurel Hill East is more a Victorian cemetery associated with the Civil War. Laurel Hill West is more an Edwardian cemetery associated with the Great War. Like Laurel Hill East, it is open 365 days a year, 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. for now. There's plenty of parking at the business office just off Belmont Avenue or at the conservatory in the bell tower. If you enter from Belmont, follow the road past the second gate with the white line in the middle. Another possibility, just come in while you're walking the Kinwood Trail. This mid-September 2025 podcast is about a forgotten political figure from early 20th century Philadelphia. John H. Fow was a lawyer known in his day as a bombastic figure with an odd waddle walk, which gave him two nicknames, Foghorn and Ducky. Despite his rough exterior, he had a brilliant knowledge of the law and had much bad legislation declared unconstitutional. It was probably his sharp tongue and wicked sense of humor that endeared him to most of his colleagues, and nobody seemed to mind when he wrote the definitive essay that debunked Philadelphia seamstress and upholsterer Betsy Ross as creator of our first American flag. Let us hear about John Henry Fow. John Henry Fow, 1851-1915. Ducky for the walk, Foghorn for the talk. The closing decades of the 19th century were a pivotal period in Pennsylvania's political evolution, defined by industrial expansion, social upheaval, and the relentless grip of machine politics. In this era, the state's political arena became a microcosm of Gilded Age America, where the collision of ambition, reform, and entrenched power set the stage for battles with lasting consequences. The late 1800s witnessed the Republican Party consolidating its dominance in Pennsylvania to an extraordinary degree. Industrialization had transformed the state into an economic powerhouse. Steel mills rose in Pittsburgh. Anthracite coal mines tunneled deep beneath the earth in the Northeast. And railroads stitched the state together, facilitating commerce and migration. The fortunes of these industries were inextricably linked to Republican rule, as party bosses brokered deals that favored business interests and secured campaign support from powerful magnates. A complex web of local ward leaders, state legislators, and national politicians ensured continuity of control. Patronage appointments, jobs distributed in exchange for political loyalty, were the lifeblood of this system, fostering personal dependence on the party and stifling meaningful opposition. Election contests were often decided before the first vote was cast, with machine operatives ensuring the right outcomes through tactics that range from the mundane to the outright corrupt. It was during this time that muckraker Lincoln Steffens was writing about Philadelphia being corrupt but content. Yet this was also an age of anxiety and agitation. Rapid urbanization brought waves of European immigrants into Pennsylvania cities, straining the resources of municipal governments and complicating traditional patterns of allegiance. Meanwhile, calls for reform grew louder, championed by a coalition of urban professionals, journalists, and dissident politicians who recoiled at the spectacle of an unchecked machine power. This ferment produced rare moments of Democratic ascendancy, as with Robert Pattison's election as governor. Reformers pushed for civil service laws to curb patronage, the regulation of monopolies, especially railroads and utilities, and greater government accountability. Still, Republican leaders skilled at co-opting reform rhetoric when expedient often managed to blunt or redirect reform impulses to preserve their supremacy. It was a time when personalities mattered, and the ambitions of a few could tilt the balance of power. On the Republican side, Boyce Penrose emerged as the quintessential party boss, wielding influence through both legislative cunning and mastery of political patronage. Penrose and his allies mobilized vast resources, financial and human, to maintain the machine's sway across both city and countryside. I talked about Penrose back in All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories number 37, Boys Will Be Boys, Penrose and His Brothers. Democrat Robert Pattison's governorship cracked through the Republican wall twice, in 1883 for 4 years, and then again in 1891. Although he was mostly stifled by a Republican legislature, Pattison proved that insurgency was possible, if fleeting. Pattison, who has a major thoroughfare in South Philadelphia named for him, is buried at Laurel Hill West. I haven't done a podcast about him yet. Meanwhile, another Philadelphia Democrat, Samuel Randall, encapsulated the complexities of the period. He was a Democrat. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives, but his conservative positions often aligned him with the state's business establishment, the Republicans. This further muddied the traditional lines between the two parties. Randall is interred in the South Section at Laurel Hill East. He was Speaker of the House during several years of Reconstruction. I talked about him in All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories number 44, The Garfield Connections. As second in line to the presidency, he is our highest-ranking politician, but he seldom gets mentioned on tours. A significant figure who seems to have faded into history is Democratic Congressman John Henry Fow of Philadelphia. Fow, F-O-W, was a complex individual whose influence in the city and in the Commonwealth from 1890 to 1915 was inescapable. He possessed a commanding presence, a booming bass voice that shook the rafters at City Hall, a distinctive waddling gait, and a sharp sense of humor, which contributed to his reputation for practical jokes, some of which were regarded as harsh or even cruel. Fow also authored the leading treatise of his era on the evolution of the American flag and effectively challenged the narrative surrounding colonial seamstress Betsy Ross. In retrospect, Fow's personality seems every bit as oversized as that of Boyce Penrose. Penrose has a larger-than-life statue outside the Capitol building in Harrisburg. For reasons which are very unclear to me, Fow has been mostly forgotten. Maybe it's as simple as Penrose being a Republican and Fow a Democrat. I know that when I did the podcast about Penrose and his brothers, the sources were, if not limitless, then at least generous. With Fow, I found the standard 2 or 3 page biographies that went into the who's who books of those days. They were for the most part an accounting of relationships and accomplishments, social clubs, professional societies, etc. For the good stuff, I had to depend on newspaper reports. It wasn't for a deficit in Fow's bloodlines that he was ignored. His bloodlines even challenged those of Penrose. The name Fow is relatively rare in America. It seems to be derived from an English or a Scottish background. John's great-grandfather Matthew Fow was a member of Captain Josiah Harmer's battalion of the 1st Pennsylvania Battalion, the first peacetime regular Army infantry unit authorized by the Confederation Congress after the American Revolutionary War. The ancestral history of Fows in America can be traced back to 1728. John's father, Jacob, was a butcher who died when John was still a teenager. His mother, Margaret, was a granddaughter of Michael Gerberger of the regiment of Duc de Lausanne of the French Allies at Yorktown. John attended public schools in Philadelphia, and then he studied law under the Honorable F. Carroll Brewster, who later served as Commonwealth Attorney General. Fow was admitted to the bar on May 4, 1878. He was 27 years old. Soon he joined the herd of political animals and developed a reputation as a man fearless in defense of his beliefs and principles. He was a member of the Democratic State Committee in 1882-83, and then he served as the first president of the Democratic State League. In 1882, he was a member of the Bicentennial Committee on the 200th anniversary of the founding of the city. And in 1887, he was chair of the subcommittee of the celebration of the adoption of the Constitution. In 1889, John Fow was elected to the lower house of the state legislature, then was re-elected to serve a total of 6 non-contiguous terms. A contemporary observer stated, "Unbiased by a strong personal feeling, yet standing unequivocally for principles in which he believes, the sincerity of his motives has never been questioned, and his rational and practical views have at times won a large following." Mr. Fow is regarded as an excellent lawyer and a statesman of ability. Added to this, he had gained noteworthy praise in the field of journalism. His connection with the Philadelphia Evening Star as special correspondent from Harrisburg to the World Columbian Exposition in 1893, bringing him into prominence in that regard. He is regarded as one of the best speakers on the rostrum in this country, and as a lawyer has a reputation of having many legislative acts declared unconstitutional. He has displayed ability in business circles as the president of the Willow Grove Trolley Railway Company. His writings have brought him more than local fame. His article on Washington crossing the Delaware had a potent influence in the adoption of the bronze tablet representing Pennsylvania, which is placed on the monument in Trenton, and so on. If this cut-and-dried biographical sketch were comprehensive, I'd be done with this podcast, and it wouldn't be a very interesting podcast. But the newspapers kept tempting me with various anecdotes. I'm going to start with a one-paragraph note that was in the Philadelphia Inquirer, October 27, 1891. A civil suit was begun yesterday in the Court of Common Pleas against John Fow's Club, the 17th Ward Democratic Association. The action is brought by Albert S. Martin, a neighbor, who declared that the club is a nuisance and that gambling and drinking are allowed on the premises. John Fow, president, and the members of the club are named as defendants. A year later, November 2, 1892, this story hit the Philadelphia Inquirer. Money talks is an old saying in the sporting and political worlds. That money stops talking was also practically demonstrated yesterday when the contributors to the local Republican pool to wager on Harrison shut up the bragging Clevelandites as tight as a Brooks high-license saloon on a Philadelphia Sabbath. Magistrate Israel Wellington Durham, that's Izzy Durham, treasurer of the Combine's Harrison Syndicate, has just about $10,000 still on tap. upon which he is anxious to draw to accommodate any venturesome Democrats who wish to bet on Cleveland. The handsome young member of the minor judiciary ran himself out of breath yesterday morning, vainly chasing up rumors that someone was willing to risk his cash on the democracy's favorite. After diligent search, he came across John Fow, who made so much hurrah the night before about being prepared to cover any sum from $1,000 to $20,000 that Republicans might put up on Harrison. While it was not for a moment thought that Fow was in a position to do anything of the kind, Judge Durham determined to quickly shut him up. Fow finally hedged by saying that the money was down at Laughlin and McManus in the Drexel building. "Now," said Durham, with fire in his eyes and shaking his index finger under Fow's nose, "I'll bet you $50 right here that the money is not down there. And I'll bet you $50 more that it will not be down there when we get there. We'll go down there right now." Fow flunked completely. There was no more bluffing from that quarter during the day. February 10th, 1893, Wilkes-Barre Times. Foghorn Fow got his anti-cigarette bill through the House, and it is now before the Senate. In the more dignified body is likely to receive that due consideration which was not given it in the lower house, or if given, passed carelessly over, as is frequently the case. The fact is that nothing would better please the Cigarette Trust than the final passage of this bill and its becoming law. And Mr. Fow probably knows this. He's one of those peculiar reformers who can scent afar off the true flavor of the smoke that beclouds a rich lobby. We do not say there is any lobby working for or against his bill. The bill is aimed to stop the sale and use of cigarettes by boys under 18 years of age. Nobody objects to that if it could be carried out, but it can't. The very knowledge that it is unlawful for a boy to buy or smoke a cigarette would stimulate the evil, on the same principle that the child warned against indulging in jam during the absence of a parent is generally found subsequently magnificently frescoed with jam from head to foot. Again, it is not the cigarette, but the tobacco in it which is harmful, as the weed in any form is harmful to developing youth. Now, the very Republican Philadelphia Inquirer reported on the story in this way. And so it is going back to committee, that infamous bill drawn by traction lawyers and introduced into the legislature by John Fow, traitor to his city and a willing servant of the traction company. Monstrous measure has been smoked out, and the citizens of Philadelphia will have a chance to protest. The bill is in strict accord with the advanced thought of our citizens upon the subject as expressed in the newspapers, said Mr. Fow, a statement which is just as misleading as his bill. At an October 1893 meeting of the Stylus Club, Colonel Archibald Loudon Snowden, a First City troop, spoke of his experiences in Greece while he was representing the United States. Snowden, who's interred at the bridge section of Laurel Hill East, was serving simultaneously as United States Minister to Greece, Romania, and Serbia from 1889 to 1892. When he finally gave way to Fow, the next speaker, the Foghorn order arose and, walking up and down, said, "Mr. Chairman, members of the club and guests, I take a great deal of pride in announcing that my father was 25 years in Greece. I mean Greece. He was a mutton butcher." At this sally, roars of laughter prevented the irrepressible Fow from being heard. Next story, Harrisburg Telegraph, October 10th, 1895. Next door to the office of a popular magistrate in the central portion of the city, there is a small tailor shop which has this sign in the window: "Trousers pressed while you wait." Quite a number of politicians frequent the magistrate's office, and they often drop into the tailor shop to have the bags taken out of their trouser knees. One day last week, Select Councilman Tommy Ryan and several up-country delegates were sitting in the tailor's back room while their respective pantaloons were being ironed. Representative John H. Fow, who is forever on the lookout to play a practical joke, passed the door of the shop and took in the situation at a glance. Mr. Fow raised his mighty foghorn voice in one wild cry of "Fire!" The effect was instantaneous and startling. Mr. Ryan, the first to rush through the shop door, was clothed, as to his nether extremities, in flaring scarlet. Two of the country politicians wore gray and white, but the third wore not much of anything. His shirt was pretty long, but it did not prevent the few pedestrians on the street from seeing his bare knees knocking together with fright. When the victims realized the trick that had been played upon them, they scurried back to shelter. Wilkes-Barre Times, April 9th, 1896. Representative John Fow, as a practical joker, let himself loose again a few nights ago. The victims this time being boarders at the Farmers and Mechanics Hotel, 7th and Girard Avenue. It is the custom of the farmers who come into market on Friday to secure their rooms, each with a big brass number tag attached to it, and to leave the keys on the keyboard in the hotel office. On Friday night, about 20 jovial farmers went out for a lark, leaving their keys behind them as usual. In their absence, the irrepressible Fow took their keys and, removing all the number tags, mixed them up indiscriminately. About midnight, the farmers came back and, taking their keys from the rack, went up to their rooms. A scene of great confusion and the sound of much angry swearing followed. The puzzled farmers chased up and down the corridors for over an hour trying to find the right keys. Some of them just gave up in disgust and slept all night in the hallways. I remember back in 1893, Fow had fought to ban the use of tobacco, but not necessarily cigarettes, to people age 18 or less. In 1914, in the Philadelphia Inquirer, February 22nd, page 25, there's a very official-looking photo of Fow, Pennsylvania's foremost constitutional lawyer and father of Pennsylvania's original cigarette law, end quote. He appears to be endorsing Smoko as a method to treat catarrhal and bronchial infections, a tobaccoless cigarette made of herbs. What a coincidence. September 1915, article in the Allentown Democrat. It's about a local politician character named William H. Sowden, not Snowden, but Sowden. And comparisons were made to Fow. Said Mr. Fow was for a generation one of the most forcible and picturesque figures in the affairs of the Democratic Party of the state. Like Sowden, Fow was a man of great force of character and decided opinions. And when his mind was made up to espouse any cause, he fought for it with the same determination that characterized the fighting of Sowden. He had eccentricities of speech and manner, just as Sowden had them. He cared not for conventionalities, neither did Sowden. He was never happier than when he was in a fight and when the odds were against him, and there again you have Sowden. He was admired by his friends because of his ability and feared by his adversaries because of his nerve and resourcefulness. How like Sowden! He was always a herd fighter, a determined fighter, an aggressive fighter, no matter whether he was fighting for a client in a court of justice or for himself on the political stump. John H. Fow had a powerful voice. It won for him the nickname of Foghorn Fow. This powerful voice he was wont to raise both in his political and legal battles, and could turn on the lung power and yell down any antagonist. Fow anecdotes seem endless. 1934, this is 19 years after he died, Foghorn still stirred memories. There was a letter to one of the columnists in the Harrisburg newspaper. It brought back another story. It said, "Did you hear the one about the Capitol Park squirrels? Years ago, when the squirrels were imported to Harrisburg, they were very tame and were among the outstanding attractions of the capital city. A Representative John Fow, he of Foghorn fame, was interested in seeing that they received ample food supply. At the time, the state made no provisions for feeding them. John, upon this particular day, while feeding an especially friendly one, was amazed to have the little fellow snatch a nut from Mr. Fow's hand and, like a flash, run for a tree and climb into its branches. Fow, unable to understand the unusual conduct on the part of this squirrel, looking down the walk, saw approaching a chap for whom he had formed a dislike, and he said, "Oh, I understand now." He saw Mr. coming up the walk and was afraid he'd come and take the nut away from him. Now, regarding this importation of squirrels to Harrisburg, that got me curious. It turns out that, yes, there were plenty of squirrels on the American continent. They're indigenous to North America, but urban development had chased them out of the cities, out of their habitats, along with hunting for fur and meat by early settlers. And as American cities began to establish designated park areas, they decided to reintroduce squirrels to the park. And the first place this was done was Franklin Square in Philadelphia. It was successful, so it was done in other parks throughout the United States. And that's about the time that they reintroduced the squirrels to Harrisburg. Another former colleague reported during the closing days of the legislature when a representative pled his case before the legislative body for a bill that would increase the appropriation for the care of the feeble-minded. As he concluded, he demanded, "What shall we do with our feeble-minded?" And from the other side of the house came the deep bass tones from the throat of John Fow, "Send them to the legislature." His mischievous behavior was difficult to restrain. On one occasion, he encountered the remnants of a dentist's office discarded on the sidewalk following a recent fire. Succumbing to temptation, Fow stuffed a handful of miscellaneous teeth into his pocket. And later that morning, while he was conversing with colleagues in the cafeteria, he discreetly placed some of the dentition into coffee cups and cereal bowls and the scrambled eggs, and the ensuing discovery of teeth led to considerable disorder and accusation within the cafeteria. There are a lot more stories like this. I swear, they're scattered through more than 20 years worth of Pennsylvania newspapers. I saved my favorite. This is not the last, but this is probably my favorite. This is in 1895. There was a legislator from Lancaster County who was known for his agreeable demeanor, complete lack of resentment, which made him the subject of a prank by Foghorn. Now, during this session, there was a lot of discussion about the risks associated with transporting high explosives, particularly nitroglycerin, which is heavily used in mining and railroading and other industries. It was being transported on railroads and public conveyances throughout the state. And this had the legislators worried about the safety of the people in the state. So one day, this gullible member was given a bill by a colleague who was collaborating with Fow. He was asked to present it as a courtesy. He was informed that there were substances considered much more hazardous than nitroglycerin being transported without clear identification by railroad and steamship companies. The proposed bill aimed to address this issue by prohibiting the transport of such material within the state unless it was clearly labeled and properly guarded. The bill followed the standard legislative format. Be it enacted that on and after the passage of this act, it shall be unlawful for any transportation company, etc., to handle either in its crystalline form or solution the chemical known industrially as sodium chloride. The legislator then spoke at length regarding the perceived dangers of handling this chemical, described as one of the most powerful explosives known to science. As the members of the legislature gradually realized that the chemical in question was table salt, the tone in the chamber shifted from quiet amusement to open laughter. Now, Fow, despite his sense of humor, showed that he could be a serious historical scholar when events called for it. And on occasion, he would even allow sentiment to show through. Once there was a heated argument in court. He was challenged as to whether he ever read the Bible. His opponent threw an open Bible on the table in front of him, challenged him to read right out of the Bible. Foghorn lifted the good book, and he glibly started to read, and soon he started to slow, and he stopped, and he burst into tears. He was reading the psalm that his first wife had requested him to read to her shortly before she died. He probably kicked up the most dust when he confirmed that a seamstress named Elizabeth Claypool, better known as Betsy Ross, had absolutely nothing to do with the design of the original Old Glory 13-star, 13-stripe flag. The term Old Glory, by the way, had first been used in 1839 by a Salem-based sea captain, William Driver. Now, yes, there was indeed a Philadelphia woman named Betsy Ross. She did work at upholstering and as a seamstress during the Revolution. She's said to have lived in a house at either 80 or 89 Arch Street in Philadelphia. That's the old numbering style, now said to be 239 Arch Street. And legend has it, at some time in June of 1776, she designed and made the first American flag as we now recognize it. Fow compared this legend with the works of painters who failed to study their topics carefully before putting them down on canvas. The two most famous examples he gave were Leutz's painting of Washington crossing the Delaware and Benjamin West's painting of William Penn treating with the Indians. To the first, I write from authority, having been designated to represent the legislature of Pennsylvania as one of a committee of 3 to act in conjunction with the Trenton Battle Monument Committee to select an historical subject for the medallion to be placed upon one of the 4 sides of a monument erected at Trenton to represent Pennsylvania's part in that memorable event. We chose as the subject Washington crossing the Delaware. And the result of our labor and investigation in conjunction with the Monument Committee can be seen today on the west side of the monument. The bronze tablet placed there by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, truth finally delineates that notable event. The late General Stryker of New Jersey aided us and furnished us books and documents to obtain part of the data. The tablet represents a small rowboat with General Knox sitting in the bow of the boat and Washington in the stern. The man rowing the boat was a Mr. Cadwallader. He lived at McConkey's Ferry on the Pennsylvania side of the river. Leutz, in his painting, has Washington standing alongside of a horse in a large scow, such as were used in those days on the upper Delaware to take produce to Philadelphia markets. A number of others are in the same boat, one holding aloft a flag containing a blue union with 13 white stars, a flag that did not come into existence until 6 months after the battle was fought. The Philadelphia contribution to the Trenton Monument was painted by portraitist Thomas Eakins. Now, the Betsy Ross claim was based upon the assertion set forth in a paper read in 1870 by Mr. William Canby before the members of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. It was claimed in the paper or essay that from traditions existing in the Ross family, Betsy Ross, the grandmother of Mr. Canby on his mother's side, was the maker and designer of the first American flag and that she lived on Arch Street. Research showed a Betsy Ross did live on Arch Street, but the exact location was doubtful, and that her maiden name was Griscom, and she was married 3 times, first to John Ross, second to Ashburn, and lastly to John Claypool. So she was actually Elizabeth Griscom Ross Ashburn Claypool. Canby asserted in his paper that a committee of Congress, along with George Washington, in June 1776, called at her house and engaged her to make a flag from a rough drawing, which, not suiting her, was at her suggestion redrawn by Washington. Even the paper presented before the Society in 1870 acknowledged that a design created by another party was brought to Mrs. Ross, but she purportedly made certain modifications. This constitutes the extent of available information regarding Betsy Ross. That's it. Nevertheless, it continues to be taught that Mrs. Ross designed, originated, and created the first American flag, despite the complete lack of substantive documentation for this claim. Artistic depictions, lithographs that contributed to this popular narrative, even though the events they portray lack strong factual foundation compared to other historical artworks. Those familiar with the history and development of the national emblem often do not find direct evidence supporting the Ross story. For example, a history published in 1879 does not reference her contribution, consistent with earlier authorities prior to the emergence of the Ross claim, excepting some accounts written subsequently. A similar account to the one associated with Betsy Ross was put forth by Elizabeth Montgomery, daughter of Captain Montgomery of the armed brig Nancy, who claimed that a Stars and Stripes flag was produced early in July. At the outbreak of our revolutionary struggle, the different colonies had flags of their own design, which if grouped together would have reminded one of Joseph's coat, embellished with Latin and other mottos. Now, Betsy Ross's remains are scattered all over Philadelphia. She was first interred at the Free Quaker Burial Grounds on North 5th Street. 1856, Mount Moriah Cemetery in West Philadelphia acquired the remains of Ross and her third husband, John Claypool. I'd like to think this was a celebrity corpse like Laurel Hill East had done, bringing celebrity corpses, but this was years before her grandson made the claim that she had created the flag. So she was not a celebrity in 1856. Now, what they found at the old Quaker ground was moved to Mount Moriah. There were a few bones. Years later, the Daughters of the American Revolution erected a flagpole at the site at Mount Moriah. 1975, in preparation for the American Bicentennial, city leaders ordered the remains of Betsy Ross moved to the courtyard of the Betsy Ross house. Well, the cemetery workers went to her tombstone and they didn't find anything. They dug around a little bit. They found some other bones in the family plot. They said, those are Betsy's, and they declared, these are Betsy Ross's bones. And reinterred in the current grave visited by tourists at the Betsy Ross house on Arch Street. And it's all made up. Foghorn Fow had a second nickname. The term Ducky actually originates from the English language. It's an affectionate diminutive. If you remember some British films where they call a certain loved one Ducky, the earliest recorded appearance goes to the 17th century in British England. Duck was employed as a term of endearment, dear or darling. If you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, Duck is a pet name since at least the time of Shakespeare. And Ducky developed as a playful and affectionate variation of the original term. To this day, if you go into a shop in Derbyshire, not unusual for the shopkeeper to say, "Hey, how are you, Duck?" regardless of age or gender. In the 1986 film, remember Pretty in Pink? Character named Ducky. Ducky had the qualities, loyalty, amiability. Nevertheless, evidence suggests John Henry Fow acquired his secondary nickname primarily due to his distinctive gait, characterized by a slow waddle. Now, the year before he died, John Fow was in the news when a judge chastised him. "I believe you're trying to tamper with this court, Mr. Fow. Every time you come in here, you have some excuse for a postponement. Women are brought here with their children, and we are going to hear their cases." Election day of 1914, it was noted that Senator Boyce Penrose was reelected after spending $9,073.87 in his contest, and that he had received no contributions. John Fow reported that as the unsuccessful Democratic candidate for Congress from the 3rd Pennsylvania District, he had neither contributions nor expenses. "The reason, I suppose, is that my friends, and especially the Congressional Committee, did not know that I was a candidate. Unless it can be said that 160 pounds of hot air called speeches, supposed to have been inflicted on members of the Senate and the House, can be called contributions from the latter." Mr. Fow concluded with a bitter complaint that President Wilson did not send him a letter of endorsement. It was hard to tell from the article whether his tongue was in cheek when he said that or not. John Fow's death occurred the last day of August 1915. at his summer home in Spring Lake, New Jersey. 2 weeks earlier, he'd suffered a stroke, from which it appeared he had recovered. He was survived by a wife and 3 sons. The Public Ledger gave him props. Mr. Fow became such a familiar figure about City Hall that a trip through any of its corridors seemed incomplete unless Mr. Fow emerged from one of the doors. Mr. Fow had a habit of appearing like a bolt from a clear sky in cases with which it was thought he would never have had the slightest connection. Often, too, his blustering manner and positive assertions overawed the opposing attorney. Practices and systems which were thought to be highly proper were often proved to be entirely wrong, unconstitutional, and out of order by Mr. Fow. Mr. Fow was a great hunter. His exploits in that sport were usually heralded around City Hall. He gained the nickname of Ducky because of his marksmanship in duck shooting. Again, I can't tell how far in the cheek the tongue was pressed when a reporter wrote that. The obituary goes on to relate one of his last appearances in court. This is pushing the envelope pretty far. Fow was delivering one of his usual oratories. There were 2 judges hearing the case, and one of them got up to leave the courtroom, and Fow stopped talking. He said, "I fear I begin just as the light of the court is going out." The retiring judge looked back and asked, "What light do you mean, Mr. Fow?" And Fow replied, "The Israelite, of course." He was not rebuked. Among the bills he introduced that were made into law, an act that does away with kissing the Bible in legal proceedings, Saturday half-holiday bill, and a large number of acts relating to the practice of the law and municipal affairs. Now, for a man who was by all descriptions larger than life, his presence in contemporary searchable material is maddeningly incomplete. There's a scattershot anecdotes among a handful of Pennsylvania newspapers that are forced to serve as a spotty biography. And as far as photographs, there's nothing. There's next to nothing. I found 2 photographs of this guy, and that was it. This is a guy whose stories need to be captured and his life needs to be fleshed out. But until some brave historian who's actually trained to do this stuff tackles the legendary life that appears to be that of John Henry Ducky Foghorn Fow, I suppose this podcast is going to have to serve as his tribute. In the October 2025 episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 78, it's about thugs and gangsters. There were 4 distinct ethnic groups running gangs in late 19th and early 20th century Philadelphia: the Irish, the Jewish, the Black, and the Italians. The Italians were subdivided into the Black Hand, the Mafia, and independent operators like the Lanzetti brothers. Petito, Little Petey Biscotti, got caught in a deal gone wrong and died with 3 others in the so-called Flag Day Massacre. He's buried at Laurel Hill East. Victor Babe Andreoli died in a restaurant shootout with police. He is at Laurel Hill West. Although I could find no direct connection between Laurel Hill and the South Philadelphia arsenic murder gang, Raymond Pace Alexander did take the case for one of the defendants. That's good enough for me. I want to talk about the arsenic gang. One of the Lanzetti brothers, Will, was consigned to earth at Laurel Hill West. In other words, he was cremated and his ashes were put someplace where nobody can find them. So that is what we're going to talk about in October on All Bones Considered. October's Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West stories, will be about spousal mariticide and uxoricide, husbands and wives who kill each other. I've got a few of these set aside for Halloween month. For upcoming activities and tours, go to the website, laurelhillphl.com/events. If you're listening as this came out, don't forget the Market of the Macabre, September 20th. I will be there at a table selling copies of All Bones Considered, 52 Laurel Hill Women. The book is also available from the cemetery. You can go to the gift shop. You can pre-order it from Amazon or Barnes & Nobles. You can order it from the bookshop if you go to the online bookshop. I've got some author events already arranged, starting at the Gladwin Library on September 24th. And then I've got author events at the Bala Library, Bryn Mawr Ludington Library, Lower Merion Historical Society, all coming up through the rest of the year. All Bones Considered, Biographical Bytes from Bala are mostly research, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, volunteer tour guide, volunteer podcaster for both cemeteries. Reach me through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. Theme song, Names at Peace, is by local artist James Harrow. Maybe I will see you on a tour. I've got some coming up in November. Stay safe, stay well. And normally I'd say bibliography's coming up next. There was no bibliography. Everything was out of the newspapers. I could read you the names and the dates out of the newspapers, but forget it. There was no book that I consulted that told me anything about Foghorn, Ducky, Fow. So everything you heard was out of the newspapers. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.